Hi, everyone. I'll give us all a few minutes to get into the Zoom room, get connected, and we'll get started in just about a minute or two.
Good.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kaylee McNeil, and I am a 1L at GW Law. I am a 1L representative for the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund at GW, and also a member of the Black Law Students Association here. I would like to thank you all for joining us for this panel event on racial justice and animal protection. This event is co-hosted by the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund and the Black Law Students Association. Before we get started today, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous land on which GW sits, as occupied by the Anacostan, Nacotchtank, and Piscataway peoples. As a quick housekeeping note, this event will be recorded and then it will be posted onto our GW Law SALDF YouTube page, where you can feel free to rewatch it or share it with other folks who weren't able to make it today. This event was born out of discussions between the president of SALDF, Michael, who's on this call right now, and myself regarding our shared passion for both animal protection and racial justice, as well as our shared frustrations for the historical and present divisions between the two movements. This exact topic is actually what brought me to law school this year, and I am so excited to have this amazing panel of scholars and activists here with us to take part in this important conversation. So thank you so much to our panelists for taking your time to be here today. Thank you also to our moderator for this evening, Professor Gambert. Professor Gambert teaches here at GW Law, and her scholarship includes work on feminism, critical animal studies, and critical race theory. So we are very honored to have her guide this discussion. I will now turn it over to Professor Gambert to introduce our panelists.
Okay, thank you, Kaylee. Thank you, Michael. Thank you to SALDF and BALSA for putting together this event. And thank you to everyone here in the Zoom room. I know it says there's 27 of us, and it looks like people are here from all around the country. I also want to recognize the students in the Animal Injustice Seminar that are Zooming in from San Francisco. It's great to have all of you here, as well as just everyone else that is joining us. As Kaylee said, my name is Iselin Gambert, and I'm a professor here at GW Law. I've designed a seminar called Gender, Race, and Species that explores the intersecting oppressions of racism, sexism, and speciesism in our legal system and in our society more broadly. And I couldn't be more thrilled and honored to be here moderating this discussion with our four panelists. Our panelists are going to be discussing the structural forces that connect racism and speciesism, and talk about the intersections of racial justice and animal advocacy. And they're going to talk about strategies for strengthening and diversifying the animal rights and animal protection movements. I'm going to introduce our four panelists briefly now, and I'll invite them to tell us a little bit more about their lives and their work during their remarks today. My goal is to keep today's event pretty informal and conversational. I'm going to start by asking one really broad introductory question and asking each of our panelists to respond. And then at that point, I'd really love for this event to turn into more of a conversation amongst the panelists and me, and also between all of us and with you, the audience. So to the audience, we really want to hear from you today. If you have any questions for any of our panelists, please put them in the chat. It could be a question or a comment. I'll do my best. I'll be moderating the chat, and I'll do my best to ask those questions during the conversation. There's also going to be time in roughly the last 20 or 30 minutes of the event. We're going to run about we'll end at 6:30 Eastern time, so 90 minutes from the start of the hour here. So in around the last 20 or 30 minutes, I'll invite all of you to participate in a Q&A and a discussion where you can take yourselves off mute and actually talk to the panelists directly. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. We are joined today by Gwenna Hunter, who is the founder of Vegans for Black Lives Matter and Vegans of LA. And she's also an active animal liberation and Black liberation activist with Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, Black Women for Wellness, Black Women Farmers of LA, and Los Angeles LGBT Center South. And until recently, Gwenna was also the food aid coordinator for Vegan Outreach. We're joined by Claire Kim, who's a professor of political science and Asian American studies at the University of California at Irvine. Her writing includes works such as her book, Dangerous Crossings, Race, Species, and Nature in a Multicultural Age, an article titled Species, Race, Sex, which appeared in a special edition of American Quarterly. And she also wrote the introduction to AFCO's book, Racism as Zoological Witchcraft, A Guide to Getting Out. And I'd like to introduce Lauren Ornelas, who's the founder and president of the Food Empowerment Project, a woman of color founded and run organizations seeking to create a more just and sustainable world by recognizing the power of one's food choices. The Food Empowerment Project works towards achieving a food system that's free from the exploitation of humans and the environment, and with equitable access to healthy, sustaining food for all communities. And last but not least, we're joined by Reddy, who leads the Lewis and Clark Law School's Center for Animal Studies Global Animal Law Program, as well as that law school's Animal Law LLM program. Raj currently serves on the law school's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and International Law Committees, and he chairs the International Subcommittee of the Animal Law section of the American Bar Association. He served as a board member for Encompass, an organization dedicated to creating an equitable animal protection movement for a number of years. Welcome to our speakers. It's a thrill to have you all here. So I'd like to kick off with one sort of broad question and invite you to sort of take it in any direction that you would like based on your own life experience and professional experience. So today's event is designed to explore the intersections of racial justice and animal law and the animal rights movement. And I wonder if each of you could begin by discussing with us how you understand the intersections of racial justice and the animal rights movement, and how you view the structural forces that connect the sort of intersecting and overlapping oppressions of racism and speciesism. And then anything else you'd like to share about how your activism, your work, your scholarship responds to what you see as the problems in the animal rights or animal protection movement as it relates to racial justice. So a really big sweeping question, but if you could just kind of orient us on your thoughts around the main topic of this panel, that would be fantastic. I don't know if any of our speakers would like to begin. You can take yourself.
I'll go.
Okay, Gwenna, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. And I'm just going to speak from my own personal experience in the movement and realizing what I call a huge disconnect and large blind spots regarding different racial issues within the movement. So I've been vegan now for about 6 years. Once I came to the realization of what was going on and consumption and animal abuse, like once I awakened, I was in shock. And immediately I just wanted to get involved. I'm like, I've never wanted to be involved in a movement before. This was the first time. So I'm like, let me get involved in this. I'm like, wait, I'm in Los Angeles. There's vegans here. So there's people that really care about the world. Because if you care about animals, you definitely have it figured out about humans. That was my thinking. And, I realized that couldn't have been further from the truth. It would be really shocking to be in circles and bring up maybe something that happened on the news or, a huge incident regarding race, and people would not want to have the conversation, would just like look away or just be quiet. And I was really shocked behind having these experiences over and over. And then I started noticing people that would just really brag about not liking people. And I get it, but it shouldn't be something that you're proud of, especially if you're advocating, you want a vegan world. Oftentimes people would say if the world just became vegan, everything would be cured. We'd have a perfect planet. And I'm like, how? Broccoli is not going to stop pedophilia. Eating apples is not going to stop racism. Like, you still have to do the inner work. And so I just found it just to be such a huge disconnect on so many levels. So I just wanted to just share that experience. And even though I do feel like there's more awareness now, there's a little bit more inclusion, as performative as it may be sometimes, you got to start somewhere. So I'm not going to judge too harsh, but you got to start somewhere. But I'm not seeing the equity. There's still a lot of huge blind spots, but I do at least feel good that at least these conversations are being had for once.
Thanks, Gwenna.
Yeah, Lauren.
Honesty about it all. I mean, I probably have I got involved in the animal rights movement in 1987. I went vegan in 1988. My life has been the animal rights movement. And over time, what I experienced and was having not allowed to be my full self, being told when I talk as a Hispanics, a very proud Mexican, that I would be hurting the animals if I talked about farm worker justice. I was hurting the animals if I talked about slavery in the chocolate industry. Whereas in my mind, all of this stuff was connected. We don't use the word intersectional at Food Empowerment Project. That seems very specifically something created for Black women to talk about their life experiences, but we do talk about how these issues are connected. And so, many women of color, many people of color in general in the animal rights movement have been forced to remove a part of themselves just to fit in, just to try to be that, mainstream animal rights person that the movement for a long time seemed to yearn for, so that we could fit in. Because in the very beginning in the 80s, we also had a stereotype that we were trying to get away from. But instead, we've got like 100% in another direction to becoming more mainstream. And I think that in my experiences, what's happened is there is more awareness. But I do honestly feel like most of it's cosmetic diversity. I have seen, a lot of money poured into DEI trainings to try to get white-led organizations to be, frankly, less racist. And they're taking the money and they're hiring the people, but they're still treating them as if they're not equals. And so that's why our organization really, really believes what this movement needs to do is be putting more money into funding organizations run by Black and brown people, because there is a niche. Again, if people simply just want to look at non-human animals, we can't deny that those of us who are Black and brown are going to be able to reach out to our communities with more sincerity and more intent in being interested in their well-being, as well as what's happening to non-human animals. And that funding hasn't been there, unfortunately, for us to grow as much as we could. And so the money is instead, you have Black and brown people circulating in and out of organizations still, because they're doing the cosmetic diversity stuff, but we know when we're not being listened to, we know when we're not being respected. We can see what's happening to our colleagues who don't look like us. So I think that is one way that we need to, and I'll stop myself, but I'll say one more thing. I feel like we've also given performative sympathies to other social justice movements as well, without the earned credit there to really be talking about these issues many times.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just start off by, just talking a little bit about my entry into the animal protection movement. It started when I was teaching an introductory literature course called Animal Literature, Animals and the Human Condition. And in it, this was when I was at Indiana University, and we taught stories like Archbeak-Woman's Mouse, Kafka's The Metamorphosis, and really push students to ask questions as to why these authors used animals to tell stories about, really just human suffering and human exploitation, and what that really meant for not just the way we treat sort of the human groups that these stories were about, but the fact that animals are treated in very much these same ways. And I think Gwenna was talking about that as well. And I remember being really shocked at the end of the semester. I was asking my students, so given the fact that we know that animals can suffer in a lot of these same ways, and they're exploited in a lot of the same ways that our sort of zoomorphized protagonists are, doesn't that mean that we owe them, protections, just like, we should be paying to minoritized groups? And the students, basically to a person said, no, I don't think that means that we stop, consuming animals or using them for clothing and whatnot. And I remember several years later when I was doing my English doctoral work, I was taking a human rights and postcolonial literature course. And if folks are familiar with any of those novels, it's like the colonizer goes to this distant land and animalizes the people there, calling them or treating them or branding them with these animal markers, savage, beast, barbarian, and so on, as a means to sort of justify their commodification and exploitation. And I remember seeing all of these characters really struggling to like mimic what the colonizers, these white folks, the West, were doing as a means to sort of demonstrate their core humanity and remove themselves or strip themselves from any of these animal markers. And the conversation really started and ended there. And I remember being really disappointed because, what I asked my professor and my peers was, what about, these non-human animals to whom these people were once compared or are compared? Doesn't this just, further entrench their exploitation? And the professors were like, why are you talking about this? This is sort of outside of the realm of the conversations that we have in this class. And, that brought me to animal law. And maybe to echo Gwenna and, Lauren's observations here, I guess I thought that this was sort of the foundation, and that once you built upon this, everything would be sort of solved, but it hasn't been the case, as unfortunately I've experienced in the past few years that I've been in the animal law field. And I think I'll speak to that a little bit later, but I'll make some room here for Claire.
Hi, everyone. So I thought I'd start out just by saying I was a race scholar until maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and had always, liked animals sort of on a personal level, but hadn't thought of it as a political issue. And then I started to think about animals, in terms of theory and politics, and saw the connection to race. And that gave rise to my second book, Dangerous Crossings. One of the things I think I'm doing in my own scholarship is trying to understand structural anti-Blackness. And the book that I am just finishing now is called Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World. And there I'm really trying to say, how do Asian Americans get positioned relative to blacks and whites in an anti-black world. And I'm dealing centrally with the idea of structural anti-blackness, building upon the scholarship of Black studies scholars and activists. And so I think that what I'm interested in doing in terms of your big question, Iselin, is having conversations with people who are interested in ecological issues and interested in animal issues, and trying to talk about the importance of getting behind the kind of work Gwenna does with Black Lives Matter, getting interested in the subject of structural anti-blackness, and seeing how these other movements, animal rights, climate justice, need to be in connection with and under the rubric of the Black struggle. That's what I personally believe. Having studied anti-blackness, now having written about it and thought about what is the template for human struggles for justice, and it's the Black freedom struggle historically. If we look at the recorded history of humankind, that gives us the most inspiring and also most successful and most profound critique of power and of domination, and the most possibilities for, I think, building a different kind of world that we all would like to see. And I think, Lauren, you alluded to this, that the kind of world we want to see, right, isn't going to have class inequalities, isn't going to have the oppression of LGBTQ people. It's not going to have no attention to these other human issues, and just be vegan, right? That's not going to satisfy anyone. So I think, again, if we're looking at how do we imagine the kind of world we want to bring into existence, that the Black struggle is the source of strength and inspiration and capacity on those issues. So I'm really interested in talking about structural anti-blackness in relation to some of these other issues. And my experience recently, I've been to a few virtual conferences with mostly white folks. They were all academics talking primarily about ecological issues, but also about animal issues. And, when I raised the issue of structural anti-blackness and linking up with and supporting the Black struggle, it kind of went over like a lead balloon, for the most part. So I'm interested in advancing that conversation and trying to understand where the resistance comes from, what it's about, and how we might navigate around it.
Thank you so much. So at this point, I have a bunch of questions that I'd love to ask all of you, but I also invite you to ask each other questions, and also for people in the audience to put questions into the chat, because we can, I'll definitely be monitoring that as well. Claire, something that you just said right at the end of your remarks there, when you said, you were at some conferences recently, it was like a lot of academics, and forgive me, I'm paraphrasing here, so forgive me if I'm misstating you, please correct me, but you were saying that you were interested in raising topics around, structural anti-blackness, and that trying to have those conversations kind of went over like a lead balloon, and you're interested in sort of figuring out where that resistance comes from. And I guess I'm interested in having any or all of the panelists sort of talk about how they, unpacking that lead balloon, unpacking that resistance, curious how you, as either individuals or as members of in your professional work, sort of grapple with that, like lead balloon. I love that imagery, but grappling with that resistance, like how do each of you try to meet that resistance in your personal or in your professional work? And I guess a related question is, do you see part of your work as being like, do you see unraveling that for people, or exposing that for people, shifting people's viewpoint on that as central to the work that you're doing as an animal advocate and as someone that's a part of the racial justice movement? So I don't know if, Claire, you want to dig back into that a little bit more, or if others have anything they want to speak to that on. I guess, Claire, yeah, please go ahead.
I'll start just with a quick anecdote about teaching. I think I get more white students in my animal class than I do in my race classes. And I think one of the things they do in coming to my animal class is think, oh, good, we have a space where we're not going to talk about race. And, I correct them of that pretty quickly. And I try to explain to them in the course of the quarter that there is no space without race, there is no space outside of race, and that anytime you're talking about issues about ecology, about animals, you're also talking about race. And so, um, that's one way to address this. And when I say, I'm interested in understanding the resistance, I don't mean that in a naive way. I think I have my own theories about why there is resistance, all of the reasons that structural anti-Blackness exists. So, but it is interesting to try to think about, strategize how to overcome that resistance or how to navigate around it, particularly among people who are justice minded, right? But they don't think about anti-Blackness.
Thanks. Oh, Raj.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, and I appreciate you asking it. I think there's two ways for me. In some ways, I'm lucky. I'm attached to a university, and so I serve on a couple of DEI committees, and I'm able to support students in those two roles, and hopefully change some of the institutional policies or practices here at Lewis and Clark. But it's a very different experience. And I think, just touching on what Claire said about, in the classroom and students in some of these animal classes who come to them and don't necessarily feel comfortable, or it might be unexpected, or feel just like talking about race and culture doesn't have a place in an animal law space. And I teach international animal law, and one of the things that we have to sort of get our heads around is that some of the very first international protections on animals were created by colonizers who wanted to hunt particular animals but didn't want the indigenous communities there to hunt those animals. And that's really the source and the foundation of a lot of animal protections. It's to villainize again, disempowered and minoritized groups and empower those who are part of the hegemony. And it hopefully gets students to critically attend to, well, okay, so if these are some of the foundations for how we got some of these animal protections that we look at and appreciate today, what should our relationship with them be? What sort of conversations do we owe everybody else in this community, everybody else in this space, to talk about some of these really problematic roots? And I don't know to what extent that's really happening.
I have something to add, but Gwenna, I really think it's appropriate for you to speak if you have something to say. Yes.
Well, I wanted to hear this question asked in a less non-politically correct way, because I want to be able to really get to the root of what I want to say. But yeah, if you could ask that question again, a little less politically correct, I'd appreciate it.
Okay. I am trying to remember exactly what I said so I can try to rephrase it. I don't know if anyone else wants to sort of chime in and help me here to ask that, like re-ask that question. But yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I'm just looking at the chat.
No worries. No worries. Well, it felt like at one point you were asking, about, I guess, like kind of like using the term like pushback. Like, were you asking if how we feel about the resistance that we feel from white people in the movement when we're trying to bring up human issues?
I'd love for you to address that. I mean, I think when Claire Kim, and thank you for sparking my memory. I'm like taking a lot of notes here, so I got a little sidetracked. But yeah, I mean, something that stood out to me when Claire was talking about, you know, facing resistance and trying to bring up issues around structural racism and sort of being met with resistance. I mean, yeah, I guess, Gwenna, to your point, how does it feel when you're met with resistance if you're trying to talk about these issues to a predominantly white audience? And are there ways, you know, I don't know, are there strategies that you've used? Can you, you know, help, you know, I'm white and I'm teaching this seminar called, you know, Gender, Race, Species, and I grapple with this all the time of sort of how do I both speak as a white person, but also how do I speak to a class, you know, that represents a lot of diverse opinions, and I want to be able to talk about, you know, I want to be able to sort of cut through resistance to talking about these issues. And I'm curious to hear how you've experienced that in your life, in your professional work, and in your personal life.
Okay. Well, I can say, like, I would say probably, well, just a little bit before, I had started talking to white peers in the movement about, you know, well, how do you talk to, you know, because to me, it's always been very copy paste, where, you know, oh, go vegan, the animals are suffering, blah, blah, and it's like, that is so boring, and that is not going to penetrate most people and get them to even pay any attention. You have to appeal to people in different ways. When I first got involved in this, I was at the time working for Vegan Outreach, and it was like my very first talk I was giving at Al Marie's library, which is in like the hood of like Watts. And I was nervous. I'm like, oh God, I'm getting ready to talk about animals to, like, you know, this Black community. And this is a very, you know, economically hurt community that I was speaking in. And sure enough, it was my very first time, and I had done it. I was trained to give like an animal rights talk. Like, I hadn't found my own voice, so I had to use theirs. And it was the biggest learning lesson I've ever had. And I'm giving you the reverse first. So what I'm doing, I'm giving you like what the pushback I got from being a Black woman talking to Black people about animal rights. I went right into the whole animal rights thing, and, you know, somebody was like, what are you talking about, the animals? I'm here, I'm going through this, that, and the other. What, you know, basically, what do I give a shit about animals for when I'm suffering every day and my rights are still being violated and I'm not seen as a person? So after that experience, I'm like, you know what? I have to speak from my own heart. I can't use someone else's pitch or someone else's script to talk to my own community. And so from that point, I started learning how to have these conversations. And in learning how to have these conversations, you know, most of the time, health is one of the most common things that you can speak about. Now, you know, fast forward a few years later, you know, I'm talking to like my white peers about, you know, because I think sometimes the bottom line is, one, laziness, not wanting to get outside of your own comfort zone, of your own script. And two, there's probably fear of approaching or talking to, you know, if a Black Lives Matter group walks by while you're holding signs talking about, you know, fur, anything like that. How do you have a conversation with a group that also is trying to help change the world and make this a better place, but you two have opposing conversations? And to me, it's just simply, one, getting out of your comfort zone, changing the script and learning about other groups. You know, Black people are I'll say African Americans, let me be politically correct, are the fastest growing segment of the population that's going vegan. Like, we're really running this thing quietly, but just not so cosmetically. So it's so much information out there about what's important to Black people and about our health and about reversing diabetes and reversing certain illnesses that we think that are genetically attached to us. So there's so many different things that a person can do. So I don't know, for me, it's expand your own circle. Because I often find people that say they don't know how to talk to Black people. It's like, well, why don't you have any in your life? You know, it starts there. So this is a huge rabbit hole I can go down. But yeah, to me, it's just taking self-ownership. And if you are really, you know, being an activist and you really want to help change the world, just shift your script a little bit. Learn how to have a conversation with someone from an opposing, from a different point of view. Not everyone's going to care about animals. That's not everyone's spot. Someone's spot could be something scientific. Someone else's spot could be some research, some data. It could be athletic. It could, you know, whatever it is that makes that person tick, that could be their thing. So to think that you just tell someone that animals are suffering, stop eating them, and that's going to work, and then you get mad at that group because they're not doing that is just such hypocrisy. It's such hypocrisy, because we all have blind spots. And as much as I love veganism and it's what I advocate for, there are so many things to evolve the mind and evolve the heart. It's just not being vegan. There's so many other things as a human race that we need to work on. So I'll stop because I'll go down a rabbit hole.
I'll just continue on down the rabbit hole. For me, I mean, definitely pushback. My entire organizations has been built on centering the voices of people of color. And that includes the work that we do. And we received loads of pushback. We still do. It's evident in our funding, but it's also evident when we had to spend our conversations on in the beginning of the organization, meaning that what does chocolate slavery have to do with veganism? What does farm workers have to do with vegan? Like everything had to do with veganism, or somehow it wasn't legitimate. But our work is to connect these issues. And I will say, again, the younger generation does not need as much explanation at all. People my generation definitely need the explanation, but now young people come up to our table and they love it and they get it because they understand inherently how these things are connected. And for me, in terms of, you know, how do we talk about these things? How do we work about it? One way that Food Empowerment Project has done it is to recognize that the vegan animal rights movement, we have a just cause, right? We're advocating for beings that if we don't do so, would be hard for them to do themselves, right? I mean, that is what our whole thing is. We have a sense of empathy, justice, compassion, whatever it is that drives us. But we somehow shift when we start talking about human animals. That somehow we can understand that when you talk to an environmental group, you want to talk about the environmental issues. When you're talking about people, you know, that we can change how we talk about veganism and animal rights. But when it comes to issues impacting Black and brown people, and when we try to gear that to Black and brown people, all of a sudden, it's not about veganism anymore. And we're reprimanded for that. And what I mean by that is that Food Empowerment Project, we work to connect these issues, to show that they're all connected, right? But when we go into communities, we don't deny who we are. We work on food apartheid issues, right? We work on the fact that Black and brown communities do not have the same access to healthy foods as white and more affluent communities do. That is 100% project that we work on, but most people do not consider that to be veganism. Even though pretty much what you're advocating for is fruits and vegetables. These communities are not deprived of having eggs and bacon in the liquor store. They're deprived of fruits and vegetables, and I'll say as well, dairy alternatives. So by advocating for, well, I should say against food apartheid, we are promoting veganism, right? But we are talking about health, right? You can't deny that these dietary diseases are higher in Black and brown communities. But we don't act like, oh, we don't care about animals. We are transparent, like, hey, we're vegan for the animals. This is our little bit about the animals, but let's talk about what interests you. Because we know there are some people who, like me, I was, you know, in elementary school when I went vegetarian, we didn't have enough money for me to stick with being vegetarian. So eventually I had to eat animals again. But I'm not the only one. You know, there's other kids like that who are forced in the exact same situations. So I think that, you know, what we try to do is kind of lose some of the arrogance of the animal rights movement. This is the most important social justice issue of our time. Really? Like, I find that so freaking offensive because that implies that we've done away with racism, homophobia, sexism, because you know what? We haven't. They're all still here. So to act like all of a sudden now this is a social justice movement is arrogant, and it's insulting to all these other social justice movements that have not been achieved. So I think that some of it is saying, hey, look, you know what? I'm vegan, but my food may not be cruelty free because I'm still eating produce that's picked by people who don't make a living wage, who are forced to work out in the fields, who don't have bathrooms, who don't have health care, whose children are being forced to work in the fields. To have some humility in what it is that we're advocating for, because in my experience, we have had no pushback from any community that we've worked in, and that includes the farm worker community that are incredibly impacted by lack of access to healthy foods. And we haven't had that pushback because we're saying all of this is connected. It's not this or this. We're saying this, and this. They're all wrong. Let's work together to stop all of it that's hurting life.
Thank you. Raj or Claire, do any of you have anything you want to say in response or to build on what Gwenna and Lauren said?
Yeah, I mean, I can add on to what Lauren was saying, but I think one of the things I'll say first is, you know, with respect to your question about pushback, I think it's very much true that if you're, you know, a man talking about women's issues, you're seen as someone who's really progressive and someone who should be embraced. And if you're a white person talking about POC issues, you're embraced and seen as progressive. But if you're a woman talking about women's issues, or if you're a person of color talking about minority issues, you get a very different reception. And so it's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to talk about it, because you're seen as not informed, but maybe complaining or, you know, subversive. And so I think it's incumbent upon, you know, white folks and men, you know, in those respective categories to be talking about these issues. But I think, Lauren, we're not seen as objective. And I'll touch upon something that Lauren said. You know, I remember folks in my program when I was a student, we would always talk about, and myself too, about veganism and animal advocacy as being sort of the foundation, again, upon which all good sort of grows. And I think in the past 6 or 7 years, we've seen a lot of efforts being put towards, you know, attacking CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations, not just because of the animal cruelties, but also the violence that sort of visited upon the health and well-being of surrounding communities who are generally less economically well-off, and minority communities. And I've seen a lot of attention paid to sort of slavery and the fishing industry. And I find it curious, and I think that sort of attests to sort of veganism being sort of this foundation from which a lot of this good can grow. But I find it curious and maybe a little disconcerting that I think once we see that those same communities are advocating for like access to the ballot box, or fighting pollution not related to animal agriculture and anything to do with animals in their communities, or a quality education and things like that, we tend to, the animal protection movement tends to say, well, that's not our particular issue. We don't consider your animality or your animal interests, or we consider them insofar as they overlap with non-human animals. And I find that a little bit disconcerting for us as a movement, because if we really do, and we use this term all the time, human and non-human animals, and if we really want to respect the full range of interests that human animals have, then we need to sort of put our money and our advocacy where our mouth is. And I appreciate, again, you know, Lauren's organization for calling attention to these particular issues. We shouldn't just drop these people off when the non-human animal connection ends. That's where we should be doing even greater outreach. And it's a question to what extent, organizations are going to be taking that up and sort of really fulfilling that mission of, if we are, again, all animals, protecting us and advancing all of our interests as the kind of animals that we are.
I have a follow-up question from a member of the audience for you, Lauren. It's a clarification question. You had shared that sort of how offensive it is when vegan or animal activists refer to animal protection or veganism or the animal rights movement as the most important social justice movement of our time, and that's offensive. And the clarification question was, are you also saying that veganism or like the animal rights movement should not be understood as or referred to as a social justice movement at all, as one of many, not as the most important, but as one? So just curious to hear clarification on that.
This is when Lauren ponders to herself, does she say what she really thinks, or does she say what she thinks everybody wants to hear?
Say what you really feel.
So I would say that, do I personally think that it is? Of course I do, right? But do I get uncomfortable when animal rights people say, I work on social justice issues, I work on animal rights issues? That's what bugs me. That's what I have a hard time with. And that's what I want to say. Then no, it's not a social justice issue. Now tell me what social justice issue you work on. But do I think it is? Of course. I mean, and this is the hard thing of all these conversations to me, is that, and they're built this way, right? Is that my time a lot now is spent more talking about, at least in panels like this, the racial aspect of things. And because I'm a brown woman, all of a sudden, I'm not equipped to talk about animals anymore. Like, I'm not all of a sudden on the panels to talk about the animals. And that's really what my whole life has been about, is the animals. But I also know that I fill this void, because if I don't talk about the discrimination, racism, and everything that takes place in the animal movement, then who's going to do it? But my talks, at least when I'm talking to high school students and college students, and if I get asked to speak for Veganuary or something like that, then I'm like, oh my God, I'm getting back to be able to speak about the animals. But somehow that's been removed from me, because now I fit this role in the movement, that this is what I'm good to talk about. I can't talk about my campaigning work that I had amazing victories for anymore. I'm literally the brown person to talk about veganism. And I accept that, because I'm glad that I'm allowed to. I appreciate the space. But when a question like that happens, I feel like, hey, but don't think I'm not. I mean, like, I dedicated my life since I was 17 years old to the animals. And I would die for them, even the ones that I don't like that much. Like, I've been arrested dozens of times. I've passed legislation for animals. I feel like I always have to go down my list of arrests and bills and legislation and campaigns that I've won just to justify that I have a right to talk about these things, which may seem critical to the movement that I've dedicated my life to. So now y'all got into Lauren's head. Good for y'all.
I so freaking relate to what you just said. I feel like after I created the Vegans for Black Lives Matter group, which was just supposed to be a couple hundred people in my head, and then it ended up being a big deal. And I became also too the racial person in the movement. I even hesitated even accepting this, to be honest with you, because I'm like, but then also had to think like, you know what, you know the issues that exist, you know them firsthand, you've had a front seat. Who else better than to talk about this? But yeah, honestly, I became vegan because of like a supernatural experience with a cow. And I love sharing stuff like that. I like talking about my experience with the animals too. But yeah, it's like you get put into this box, and then it's like I burned out really harshly last year and just recently came out of it, because one, animal stuff, and then two, racial stuff, and when that's a part of your reality, you know, they're both really dark, you know, when you really get under it, because it's like with the animals, you're trying to prevent them from being slaughtered and people from eating them. With racial, you just want to be seen as equal. It's such a simple solution and it gets you frustrated. So, you know, end of the year, I just had a complete, like, I don't want to see the word vegan. I'm vegan, but I don't want to see y'all. I don't want to come to an event. I don't want to be on a panel. Like, I was just like, I checked out. So yeah, you have to be very careful of being put in these corners. And I'm learning even now, you know, if I accept something where I'm going to be on that, to check the questions first. Check is doing the interview. Like, you know, I was going to be on something last year and they sent me the questions and I canceled. I'm like, no. So yeah, I had to add that, Lauren, because that brought up some stuff.
Thank you both. Yeah, thank you for letting us a little bit inside, you know, just what you've been experiencing, both of you. I'm curious if, you know, if any of you would talk to us a little bit more about veganism and about, you know, I've been vegan for 15 years and vegetarian since I was a kid. And, you know, everyone has, like you were saying, Gwenna, you know, I'd love to hear your story about how you became vegan. But, you know, I think the vegan movement is often, in my opinion, rightly criticized for being really white dominated. I live in Washington, DC, and I would say that the like Black vegans in Washington, DC are have a really significant you know, space, like occupy a really, really big like space in the culture of DC as a city, and it's really exciting. And I'm just curious to know, I guess, for each of you, you know, do you identify as like a member of the vegan movement, if you will? And if so, you know, how does that feel to be a member of the vegan movement? Are there aspects of the vegan movement that you feel that, you know, you'd like to, you know, like, is there something that's keeping you from feeling that that's sort of an identity that you actually want to occupy, you know? So just throw that out to any of you.
I'll go on that one. I go back and forth with that sometimes. It just depends on what's going down. But through it all, like, you know, I say I'm vegan, like I don't say I'm plant-based and, you know, things like that. And the truth is, I do care about animals. You know, I was chatting with a friend of mine who's African-American, and he was like, yeah, you know, blah, blah, and all these people they care about the animals. I was like, look, I care about the animals too. You know, like that's the only reason I'm even in this, is because of the animals. But yeah, I think sometimes it just depends on, for me, what my personal experiences are in the movement. If I'm going through a rough period. And one thing I've learned too is I'm learning to mind my business and not take on other people's lack of awareness. And I'm talking about in the vegan movement, lack of awareness, insecurities, or just plain ignorance on as something that I need to be upset about or fix. So that right there has taken a huge thing off of me. So I'm learning to just like, that's your reality. I'm over here creating mine. Not that I balance, it teeter-totters sometimes, but for the most part, I'm learning to mind my business. And as I'm doing that and just really focusing on what I want to create for myself as a brand and what I want to, you know, do to change this movement and the world, it makes me feel fine to say that I'm vegan. It's just when I get caught up in other groups and orgs, or if something happens and I'm attached to it, then I start to feel a little different about the titles.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to comment on that?
For me, I'm an animal rights activist. I'm a vegan. That is who I am, and I will always be. But if you were to say, what animal groups do you follow on social media or something, there wouldn't be any, because my dedication is to the animals and advocating what they need and how I can help. Same with veganism. So I feel like, and I'm lucky, right? I say that with the privilege of having my own organization. So I can't deny that too. I get to do that work actively. But I do feel like in the other social justice areas that I work in, I definitely am that vegan saying you don't have any vegan options for the benefit. You need to have vegan options for the benefit and things like that for a labor justice event or something. Claire and Raj, talk, please.
So I think one of the issues with the term vegan is we have to acknowledge there's a lot of powerful industries out there who are trying to make that a dirty word, right? So if I start my undergraduate animal rights class and I ask them, what do you think of the term vegan? I was really shocked the last few years. They've all said, well, we think it's like a celebrity lifestyle thing, right? So somehow they associate it with wealth, with privilege, and with being a lifestyle as opposed to, a political stance. So, I mean, I identify as vegan, but I also like the terms like animal justice, climate justice. I like environmental justice. I like the other terms as well. I think that just sticking with the term vegan alone, unless it's like Gwenna's using it like vegans for Black Lives Matter, then it's automatically bringing out, right, the political aspects of it and the connection to racial justice. But I just wanted to step back for 1 minute and make a point about the structural aspect of anti-Blackness. And I noticed, Iselin, you switched it to structural racism, but I actually use the term structural anti-Blackness. And there is, we could have a whole debate about what the difference there is. But the reason is I think it's important to pay attention to as a structural issue is that, and not just as a personal issue or an organizational issue, is that I think time is very short, right? I mean, we look at the horizon that's right of closing in on us in terms of climate catastrophe. And so all of these different social justice groups or organizations or movements, how we've been asking, like, how do we bring them closer together? Or how do we bring them into dialogue with one another? And, and I have my concerns about the term intersectional because one of the reasons I'm concerned about it is it sounds like we're just saying, well, we need to acknowledge, yeah, racial justice is important too, or yeah, animal justice is important too. But to me, like if we say anti-Blackness is a structural feature of society, meaning slavery didn't end and that the hatred and avoidance of Blackness is a foundational feature of the society, what that does to an animal rights group, let's say, that doesn't deal with race, is it alerts them to the fact that anything they do is going to be anti-Black unless they deal with anti-Blackness, unless they deal with the issue. They can't just say, we're going to carve out a space where we just talk about environmental issues or just talk about animal issues, and it won't have anything to do with anti-Blackness. If you, sort of drive home the point, this is a structural feature of society, then it really is up to the animal rights and environmental folks to decide, are you going to be on the right side of history in terms of racial justice, or are you going to be actually advancing and deepening anti-Blackness by doing things in the name of animals and the environment that don't take this issue into account when it's a structural issue shaping our society? So that's why, I want to harp on the idea of structure.
Claire, can I say one thing really quick? That's that the book that you did the introduction for AFCO's book. If you haven't read AFCO's second book, it is phenomenal. But she does deal with some of the issues with using the term intersectional in that book. That's super, super powerful. So I super recommend that. And Claire had mentioned it as well. So sorry.
I'd love to ask you, Claire, and anyone else that wants to respond to this, but sort of building a little bit on maybe AFCO's work. I agree that book is phenomenal and everyone should go and read it. But so this question is actually Michael, one of the coordinators of this event, crafted this question, and I think it's a good one. So the question is, mainstream, predominantly white-led vegan advocacy groups have often been criticized for co-opting and misappropriating language, like language of slavery or Holocaust, as connected to words that might be used in reference to animals in the animal agriculture industry. But at the same time, writers like Af Ko and also Patrice Jones have in their writings discussed the so-called common roots that that socially construct animality and reinforce hierarchies across liberation movements. So I'm curious, I guess I'll throw it to you first, Claire, if you can sort of discuss your thoughts on both the sort of theoretical concept of multidimensionality of white supremacy and the practical implications for advocates, and just thoughts that you have about like use of that kind of language in the animal movement.
So this is an example of what I meant by paying attention to anti-Blackness as a structural issue. If an animal group did pay attention to that issue and they understood that slavery is, in a sense, ongoing, as many people in Black studies argue, I think very persuasively, then they're not going to make the argument that, say, for example, Stephen Best makes, that slavery is over, we successfully dealt with racial slavery, and now we can use that as an example or a model for how to liberate animals, right? No person, right-minded person who thinks at all about racial justice thinks that slavery is effectively over, right? There are many ways that it's continuing. So if you understand that history and that structural aspect of anti-Blackness, you're not going to make that very fundamental mistake. Because what happens in Stephen Best's argument is you're sort of using slavery as a prop, right? You're taking what is an ongoing experience for Black communities and using it as a prop in the animal struggle. And I think the most, the way I can make this most vivid is to talk about Sue Coe's illustrations for the book, Gary Francione's book on animal abolition. And I love Sue Coe's work, so this is not meant as a diss against Sue Coe, but on this particular volume, on the front, she has this very famous image of a male slave kneeling with his hands chained. And, it's a very famous image from the abolitionism era of 1800s in Britain and the US. And the caption was usually, "Am I not a man and a brother?" right, over the kneeling slave. So they use that image, Sue Coe uses that image and all of these chained animals, right? And that's sort of the world as it is now. And then you look at the back of the book, which is another Sue Coe illustration, and all of the animals have been freed. And it's like, this is the world with veganism, and the sun's rising and there are no more chains, but nor are there any Black people, right? So it's like either first you have the slave in the current world, but in the liberated world, in the world we're trying to build and move toward, there are no Black people. So that really, to me, sort of said volumes about what has not happened in animal liberation and environmental liberation spaces, in terms of reckoning deeply with slavery and with structural anti-Blackness.
Thanks so much. And I also love the work of Sue Coe, and I really appreciate that your analysis there. I put if you click on the link in the chat, you can see the image, and I think the image from the back cover is also there. There's 3 images there. Do any of the other panelists want to speak to that question or build off of what Claire was saying?
I'll just add something to what she said, because I remember being in the movement, and just especially like, I've not been in it that long as most people, but 6 years ago, it was definitely a different movement than it is today. And I remember there was a image that would circulate, and it would only be posted by white vegans, and it would be of a slave, of a slave, and he would have bruises and cuts all over his back, just a horrible image. And it would be something about like, they were trying to use that image as a message for veganism, and it would be like, you probably don't even have like a Black person in your life, and you're circulating, these images would be circulated by organizations or by very popular animal rights activists in the movement. And obviously people know better now, because we're getting a lot more politically careful. So I think you'd be hard pressed to see anybody circulate that image now. But yeah, it was just a hypocrisy. to even have an image like that circulating and being used as a message, especially when I had the acute awareness that no one wanted to have any type of conversations about racism or talk about humans. And it's like, but you're comfortable sharing this image to try to get your message out. And to me, it was, I would always have this love-hate relationship with the movement, because it's like, one, I'm grateful to be a part of something like this that's helping change the world and come up with solutions. But then two, it would also be embarrassing, because it's like, if anybody should get it, it should be this group. And so, yeah, I would have these moments where I'm like, I'm just done. Every year I was quitting, but but also too, there is a lot to be said about grace, mercy, and evolving. So I'm here for all of that.
And I'll say too, I mean, I guess the initial part of your question about systemic exploitation of human and non-human animal groups, I think, and again, I come from the post-colonial space, and I think the Cameroonian political theorist Achille Mbembe said, in the heyday of colonial, occupation and conquest, a difference in color constituted a difference in species, and that was really sort of the foundation for discriminating against and exploiting and commodifying all of those groups. And it's not just Holocaust and slavery images. I mean, I'm thinking just more recently to, was it the Super Bowl 2 or 3 years ago, the Colin Kaepernick commercial, where PETA had an image or an advertisement where a number of sort of non-human animals are all kneeling, and they're all sort of, asking for their rights or recognition. And again, sort of just co-opting of issues that human groups are experiencing and using it towards, animal liberation, or calling attention to these animal protection issues. And I know, I'm talking about PETA here, but I was really surprised to discover just this past year that, so International Human Rights Day was, I think, created on the day of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but I found out later that day that that's the same day that these folks chose for the International Animal Rights Day. And it's just kind of like, oh, these things are so braided, let's just, put them together. But I think what's really concerning about that is, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and this day set aside to, call attention to the need to respect the dignity of all humans is really, I think, speaking to those folks at the margins of society. And then to see sort of animals and their interest sort of brought onto that, I think is a move that was probably done by folks at the center of society, and not those who are marginalized and still looking for sort of full inclusion. And so again, I think it just happens in ways that we don't anticipate or don't really think about. And it's not just confined to some of these sort of more glaring Holocaust and explicit slavery images. It's happening much more subtly than that.
And I appreciate you mentioning that, because I think sometimes we wonder why we have, like, the vegan animal rights movement sometimes has the reputation that we have. And then we look back and we see all the things that have been done to offend women and people of color throughout the decades. We have a history of offending others because we say it's okay. We justify everything because we say, but it's for the animals. We do that to our employees, even, like, at any expense. It's okay to pay you less. It's okay not to pay you healthcare because we need to save that money for the animals, or we can offend all these people because it's for the animals. And we noticed the December 10th thing being Animal Rights Day. This past December 10th is International Human Rights Day. And we noticed the animal rights one, and I was just disgusted by that, because our organization, we use that day to talk about slavery, which 100% does exist. In the chocolate industry. And yet to see that the animal movement had done something like that was just heartbreaking. the insensitivity of it all.
And I'll add too, I mean, I wonder, like, I wish I had some insight into how that day was chosen to overlap. And I'm pretty sure it was in some way just naive or innocently like, oh, these, and this gets to the issue of like seeing all of these things as interconnected, which they are, but then sort of detracting from these human rights concerns and these human rights issues that are still prevalent today. And so I just think there needs to be more conversation around like, okay, it's not to suggest that there should not be an International Animal Rights Day, but what does it mean? And who is it calling attention away from by having them on the same day? So
I want to open this discussion up to all of you that are in the audience. I'm going to start with a question from AJ Link, who put your question in the chat. But AJ, if you want to expand on it or clarify it in any way, you can take yourself off of mute. But your question in the chat was that an earlier point that Raj made got to something you think about a lot. How do we separate white supremacy from animal rights and liberation, especially when it comes to so-called or to ethical consumption of meat, if that's even possible anymore? And AJ, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that or contextualize in your question. You can take yourself off mute.
No, that's it.
Okay, thanks, AJ. Raj, do you have anything to say in response to that?
it's something that I struggle with. I mean, I think going back and really doing a historical study of how these laws came about and what interests they advanced from the get-go, and getting folks to really appreciate how a lot of these laws were created to disenfranchise marginalized groups and enfranchise or empower particular human groups. And it's not just, I know we've been talking about this as a black and white issue, but in sort of my home country, India, you have now all of these cow protection and beef ban laws, which are created to target minoritized groups, particularly Muslims and Dalit groups, and to keep them from having access to cows who are in that country, heavily agricultural country, sort of ladders for success. And they also allow for and encourage vigilantism. So again, these laws and how they're used in certain locales are being used again to target minoritized groups. And I think, Claire wrote quite a bit about this in Dangerous Crossings, and it's where I started considering these things more critically. Just who is creating these laws, whom is it empowering, both financially and in terms of politics, but whom is it, disenfranchising, and what is our role or what is our voice in this space as human and non-human animal advocates? And in the Indian context, it's so complicated. I just don't know what the answer is, other than to sort of call attention to these issues and hopefully, make clear that some of these folks who are arguing that they are the best protectors of these particular animals, these cows, are actually the ones who are exploiting them to the greatest extent. But again, that's an application of this as opposed to a general rule. So,
Claire, I don't know if there was anything you wanted to build on. Raj referenced your book, so I didn't know if that raised any thoughts for you.
AJ, would you mind restating the original question? I got a little distracted and lost. I'm sorry.
Yeah, this is AJ speaking, y'all. So one of the points Raj made earlier was thinking about, who's codifying these laws and who's making these laws, and kind of the history of animal rights and animal protection being rooted in, all sorts of racism and other structural oppressions. And so how do we square that and separate it from the actual animal rights movement and liberation, especially when you think about ethical consumption of meat? Like, if you can still do that with, mass meat production, and are there still ethical ways to consume meat? Because, Raj mentioned Muslim, but other folks who consume meat for other, moral, personal reasons. And how do you do that?
Right. I think you also mentioned white supremacy when you first, articulated the question. So, yeah, and I've been really listening with interest, Raj, to your articulations, reminding me about some of the motives that have been behind the passage of animal protection laws in India and the U.S. And we know in Britain as well, sometimes animal protection laws were passed as a way of like controlling the so-called lower classes. So it was also class inflected. So there's always animal protection laws always carry the imprint of domination and power relations, even in intrahuman relations, not just with regard to humans and animals. But I think I just wanted to jump off your question, AJ, just the part about white supremacy, because I noticed that like there's so much interesting slippage, right, with the language. Like we've got the black and brown, we've got POC, we've got racism, we've got anti-blackness, and that's part of what is really interesting to me about these conversations, because those are all terms that I'm grappling with in my work and I in my teaching is, how do we think about these different delineations. So even thinking about how to address race and racial justice is so darn complicated with all of those terms. And then you add in, right, the animal issue. So I think one of the things that I'm interested in doing in the book I'm finishing now is talking about anti-blackness and white supremacy, because often you see in ethnic studies literature, for example, there's a lot of discussion of white supremacy, and some of that spills over to talk about animals and the environment. And then in Black studies, you see people talking about anti-Blackness. So I'm really interested in saying, how do these forces come together? How in society are we seeing both the elevation of whiteness and putting down all groups of color, that would be Black, brown, and other POC, and how at the same time is anti-Blackness going on, which elevates all groups who are not Black, right? So I think both of those forces are going on. And so I think with animal protection and environmental issues, one of the, for example, if we look at the impact of COVID, or if we look at the impact of climate disaster, we're looking at differential impacts across racial groups, racialized groups, right? So, and that means not just whites versus people of color, but Black people or Indigenous people being the hardest hit by COVID, being the hardest hit within the US by climate disaster, right? So there are all these other differentiations that have to come in, even when just talking about race. We can't just stay with white supremacy or with one term like POC.
I don't know if Gwenna or Lauren, if you either of you wanted to say anything on this conversation thread.
I just wanted to expand on something that Rajesh said earlier about like these vigilante like laws that like protect people that are like, harming animals. I believe that's something that you had said earlier. I just wanted to point out an example of that. Back in June 2020, in Canada, there is an animal rights activist by the name of Reagan Russell, who they were at, there's these things called vigils. They have pig vigils, cow vigils, chicken vigils, and basically you're there holding space for the animals and kind of like also, some of them protest, some don't, some just do meditations. They feed the animals on the truck just to give them a little bit of kindness before they meet their death, so that the animal will know what kindness felt like from a human being. So they have these vigils on a regular basis. And at this one, she was killed. She was ran over by a truck driver. And the witnesses, all say, and I believe them, that the truck driver knew exactly what he was doing, because there was a lot of like energy and tension that was going on. And she had walked not intentionally, because she's had been an activist for a long time and was one that was very compassionate, also was at Black Lives Matter rallies. Like, she got it. And yeah, he pressed the gas and completely ran her over, killed her. And of course he was found, like, he wasn't held responsible. So I just wanted to just put that out there about how these laws really do protect the abusers of animals.
I think that one of the things that's interesting too is that how many times these things happen without, I feel like a lot of times human and non-human animals are pitted against each other. That just happens Claire, maybe I'm going to use your term anti-Blackness in a sense. And during Hurricane Katrina was one of those times that they determined an area was so toxic that they weren't going to move horses back into the area where the stalls were for the horses, but they let the Black people move back into these areas. And I actually keep a folder called like animals versus humans, in a sense, that how many times it's kind of pitted against each other, that's by these situations that happen. And another one was a police officer used too much force against a dog, but then police officers aren't held accountable. So how this anti-Blackness is used is everywhere, you know, and how these things are happening constantly that show in ways that the non-human animals do get more grace or more consideration many times than do Black people in the United States.
I just want to recognize Erin in the chat, who's on the board of the Animal Save movement. Thanks for being here. And yeah, thank you, Gwenna, for sharing Regan's story. And I don't want to put you on the spot, Erin, but I just wanted to, you can take yourself off mute if there's anything else that you wanted to share or add, but with no pressure to do so whatsoever.
Oh, sure. I can say something. I'm on my phone, so I don't have my camera on. Sorry.
Hear you.
Great. Yeah, Gwenna, thank you for recognizing Regan. And I don't have too much to add, I guess, other than to say that, you know, what an example of the corollary between violence against animals and violence against humans. If you continue to perpetuate one, there will always be the other. You know, they're not separate. So that's kind of always my take-home message, I guess. Yeah, it was a very sad situation.
Thank you, Erin. I'm mindful of the time. We're going to wrap up in about 7 minutes. And so I don't know how many more questions we have time for, but I'm going to ask another sort of big one, kind of combine a couple of questions. So one is, you know, there's a lot of students in this room, primarily law students, although there might be students from other disciplines here with us. And so one question is, you know, what can students who are here today, what can they do? What can they do, you know, while they're still in school, or maybe sort of what can they do in their outside of school lives to engage with and sort of implement some of what we've been discussing. And a related, I think, question is the one that's from Devin in the chat. So without using slavery as a prop, is it still valid to use the anti-slavery civil rights movement as a guide, socially speaking, in animal rights advocacy? Or can specific legal principles from civil rights cases be used as the foundation for legal arguments in animal related cases? So a kind of broad question of just kind of what can folks in this meeting do? And that can be as lawyers, as law students, or as just as you know, humans. And then that more specific question that Devin asked in the chat. Not sure if any of you has any thoughts on that and might want to go respond first.
You know, I'll say insofar as this group is, you know, the students here are animal protection folks, be taking classes outside of, you know, animal protection stuff, and, you know, take an environmental justice course, take, you know, race in the law, take gender in the law. I know these courses are offered at a lot of institutions, and I think it will really empower you to be thinking about these animal justice issues more critically in terms of, you know, these areas where they overlap with, again, sort of the human and non-human animal issues, and not just where they complement each other, but also where there's conflict. And you can bring those conversations, I think, to your animal law classes. And I think your animal law classes and your animal law professors will be all the better for it. So, and I say that, you know, with respect to courses, but, you know, also this particular SALDF group, I think, is doing a great job. And insofar as, you know, SALDF groups are showing up this, also be showing up for, we call them here at Lewis and Clark affinity groups. So we have, an Asian Law Students Association, Black Law Students Association, be going to those meetings and see what's of import to them, and don't necessarily bring, your animal issues, which are again important to you, but don't necessarily bring them to those spaces, but go there and understand the issues that those folks are experiencing and help them on the issues that are pertinent and that they are sort of foregrounding. So those would be maybe my recommendations. And as to the question of to what extent we should be discussing animal rights and animal protection issues in relation to some of these civil rights movements, it's complicated. I mean, there are, like, as I think Lauren and I and Claire and Gwenna have pointed out, like some really problematic comparisons that you could make. And I think it just takes a lot of conversation about what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate. And I probably couldn't give you like an answer in the next, minute or two, but I think it's important for you to be having those conversations with your peers and with your professors as to what is and isn't appropriate, and with those groups who would likely be impacted by those particular comparisons.
I have a lot to say to this as well, because y'all can tell I always have a lot to say, sorry. But one of the things that I think that I would encourage you all to do is be more critical in general. If we ask people to be more critical about how they use or don't use animals, non-human animals in their lives, that we need to be critical, I would encourage you to any animal organization that you support to maybe look at them more critically. Really dive into what they're about. I know that for me, Food Empowerment Project at one point in time had a chapter in Washington State, but I realized that chapters kind of replicate colonization, and decided that chapters were not the way that my organization wanted to go into, because we wanted to kind of not identify with the white supremacy colonist way of doing things. And so I guess I just really encourage you all to look critically at the organizations that you support, the actions that they're doing. Are they truly inclusive? But I really think that it's important to, it was hard for me. We had a chapter that I loved in Washington State, but I recognized colonization. And, colonization is another thing that, we're starting to, I feel like anytime we learn anything in this movement, we kind of mess it up. And that sounds really mean, and I don't mean it that way, but like the word intersectional, we started using it for everything. And then all that we were doing at the end of the day was using it as intersectional only when non-human animals were the center of it, instead of truly looking at all the ways different things are connected and figuring out ways to stop the injustices that were taking place. And I know we're almost out of time, so I will stop myself there.
Gwenna, do you have any closing thoughts or things you want to leave us with? It doesn't even have to be responsive to the question. Just anything that you kind of want us thinking about when we leave this space.
I mean, Lauren really made a good point about being critical. It took me a long way before I don't know, I feel like I kind of, in a sense, blindly infiltrated, but not knowing that's what I was doing as I was going through all these processes. And now I have a lot more wisdom and understanding and righteous judgment, I shall say. One of the things that I'm doing right now, and I'll just share that as my last thing, I'm working, well, not working on, but I'm actually veganizing a food bank here in Los Angeles. So it's going to be operating every third Thursday of the month, starting in April. So if anyone has any connections to any vegan food manufacturers or organizations looking for, products and things like that, it will be like the first of its kind, because it's actually a brick and mortar food bank that already exists. I'm just, like I said, just veganizing it. And I was going to say, to the question of what can people, do, for me, when I wanted to get involved, I just started off just, volunteering or I didn't know where my niche was. So like I started off, like I went to some protests and I realized quickly that's just not my vibe. I think protests they change the world, but just would have me too amped. I did a speak out once. I did all types of stuff that I had no idea what I was doing. And come to find out, another stuff I was doing was really what I wanted to do. I ended up finding that, I just wanted to feed my community and let them try vegan foods. And so that's like evolved and things like that. So just, whatever it is that you enjoy doing, I know I'm very good at being of service. So, whatever your niche is, you can contribute in whatever talent that you have to this movement because it needs everything.
Thank you. I'm going to take moderator's privilege to go just 2 minutes over time and ask Claire if you have any closing thoughts or ideas for us.
I do. And, I'd say this, I get this question a lot and I say the same thing, or lately I've said the same thing, which is do a deep dive into Black history, into the history of the Black struggle, the history of slavery, and hurry before your state legislature says that it's illegal to talk about race or to do anything that creates, guilt or shame in a person, right? That's what a lot of state legislatures are doing now. They're saying critical race theory can't be taught. All the controversy over the 1619 Project by the New York Times. Is slavery the foundation of the U.S.? Can that be taught? This is really like a hot political issue right now because the right is saying learning about slavery is dangerous for our agenda, right? We don't want people learning about slavery. So if you care about justice issues, including animal justice, I think you have to. That's part of your responsibility. And to Devon's question, I just wanted to say really quickly, I appreciate where you're coming from, that you're asking, if we aren't going to use slavery or the civil rights movement as a prop, how do you use it? And I think given the history of racializing Black people in particular of animalizing them as part of the racialization, I think the answer has to be almost never, and only if you're doing it in the sense of talking about both struggles, right? In other words, it's always going to be using Black people and the Black struggle as a prop if you're doing it in the name of animals alone. Invoking the civil rights movement, invoking slavery, I think is always going to be a problem. It's an ethical problem.
Thanks for articulating that way for me. You said what I kind of felt and thought before, but said it very, very well. So thank you. I appreciate that.
I want to thank Erin for encouraging us to get involved in the Animal Save movement, and she has her email in the chat. And I want to also thank Christina for your thoughtful comment in the chat. And I know we're out of time, so I also want to deeply thank all of our panelists today. I've learned so much from all of you, and thanks to everyone that joined us today, and thanks to Michael and Kaylee and Balsa and SALDF for putting together this event. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. It was great learning from you all.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.